Maps shape how we see reality even when they leave parts of it out. Take the Arctic as an example. Deep under the sea, there is a mountain range called the Lomonosov Ridge. It runs through the center of the region, and even though it's not visible on ordinary maps, it sits just below the polar ice. Denmark, Russia, and Canada claim the disputed area as their own and have submitted legal cases with the United Nations under international law. The United States is excluded from this process. The geometry of the Lomonosov Ridge blocks its claims. As a result, the Americans are seeking to secure a seat at the table by sidelining Denmark and inheriting its claims. Right or wrong, whoever wins will get to extend its continental shelf over the North Pole, and in doing so, claim all the natural riches and change the global map and consciousness forever. There's a lot on the line. Maps, after all, have a habit of becoming policy. The Arctic, however, isn't just remote, it's also difficult to operate in. Satellite coverage is weaker at high latitudes, signals degrade, and navigation becomes less reliable. That's one of the reasons why areas like the Lomonosov Ridge are so hard to monitor, let alone control. And that brings us to today's sponsor, Spark AI, trading as SPAI in Canada and SPAIF on US OTC markets. Spark AI's proprietary technology allows drones to operate autonomously, enabling them to locate, target, and navigate entirely on their own. It's designed for situations where traditional connections either degrade or disappear entirely, and it works across air, land, and sea. In other words, they develop systems that can operate in signal-denied environments, including the Arctic. But what makes this particularly interesting is where the company is heading. Spark AI recently brought in Matt McCran, the former CEO of DroneShield, to lead its US expansion. His focus is to take Spark AI's geolocation technology into the field and form partnerships with defense contractors. That push is already showing results. The company just announced a strategic partnership to deploy its platform in Ukraine, which will be its first real-world deployment. If you want to learn more about Spark AI, check out the link down in the description. Just make sure to do your own due diligence. Discovered in 1948 by Soviet researchers, the Lomonosov Ridge split the Arctic into two pockets, whereas previously it had been assumed that the Arctic body was a single hollow basin. The ridge was appropriately named after the 18th century Russian polymath Mikhail Lomonosov, who had predicted 200 years before that such passages, cliffs, and mountains would be found beneath the Arctic ice. More than 70 years have passed since the discovery, and yet it remains one of the most poorly mapped seafloors in the world. Scientific evidence is difficult to come by because of the extreme climate. Even with multi-beam sonar technology, which is the most powerful tool for deep-sea exploration, the resolution along the Lomonosov Ridge is only on the order of hundreds of meters. Getting more accurate data requires a lot more surveys from all possible angles. What makes the process even more taxing is that charting a bathymetric map is not enough. Hard evidence, besides multi-beam sonar mapping, requires scientists to physically obtain a piece of the ridge. This is easier said than done. Getting to the Arctic is hard enough, but one then needs to extract a lump of rock that lies beneath hundreds of meters of water, topped by floating sea ice. Even after the sample is obtained, scientists need to prove that the piece is truly part of the ridge, and not some rock that drifted from elsewhere, which would give false readings. Only by following these steps can scientists trace the mountain's geological origins. The whole process takes time, expertise, and substantial funding. It's no wonder then that the Arctic seafloor is so poorly charted. This scientific progress matters because of the law of the sea protocols. All the coastal nations in the Arctic have exclusive economic zones that stretch up to 370 kilometers from their shores. Everything within this zone gives the owner exclusive rights to exploit or license living and non-living natural resources, as well as to lay down infrastructure such as subsea pipelines or submarine communication cables. However, that same law permits a state to extend its rights over the seabed for a distance of 648 kilometers from the coast. Within this extended continental shelf, a state retains exclusive rights over the non-living resources. However, while the protocols allow a country to extend its continental shelf through legal mechanisms, the overseeing committee, known as the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, is scientific in focus. The body refrains from politics and instead looks strictly to science. So, claiming a continental shelf is a scientific process. It isn't claimed by flags, but by data. 3 coastal nations, Russia, Canada, and Denmark, by extension of Greenland, claim to have sovereign rights over the continental shelf in the Arctic. And there is a reason to invest, not just because it would change the world map, but because of the wealth underneath. An assessment by the US Geological Survey estimates that about 22% of the world's undiscovered crude oil and natural gas sits in the Arctic Circle. Climate change is making those assets more accessible. However, a large segment of the Arctic, including the North Pole, currently lies beyond the exclusive economic zone of the coastal nations. Thus, a favorable verdict by the UN Commission would grant one incredible riches to exploit or license. The territorial dispute among Denmark, Canada, and Russia ultimately centers on the Lomonosov Ridge. At a depth of around 1,700 meters and a length of 1,800 kilometers, the ridge runs near the North Pole and bisects the Arctic Ocean. It is up to the petitioning nations to find scientific evidence that the ridge is a submerged extension of their respective territories. Russian scientists made their first claim in 2001, but it was rejected for lack of evidence. The Russians then made a second bid in 2015 with new evidence supporting a territorial claim of 1.2 million square kilometers. In March 2023, the UN Continental Shelf Commission declared that the outer limit of the Lomonosov Ridge was geologically similar to the continent of the Russian Federation. However, the Commission also noted that the verdict did not settle Russia's sovereignty over it. What Moscow has to do next is chart the finalized coordinates and submit them to the UN Secretary General. Those coordinates will then become legally binding for the seafloor. Be that as it may, looking from the other end, the Lomonosov Ridge also seems to be an extension of Canada. The same physical samples that Russia used to trace and map the bathymetry of the Arctic were found on Ellesmere Island, which sits in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. In 2013, Canada filed its extended continental shelf claim, but withdrew it because the claim wasn't ambitious enough. 5 years later, in 2019, Canada submitted its second broader claim, which included the North Pole. The verdict on this is still years away. The claim is effectively frozen in procedural limbo due to the Western Russian standoff. Yet, in the race for the Arctic, Denmark is perhaps the most audacious. While Russia and Canada seek to claim territory up to the North Pole, Denmark argues that the entire Lomonosov Ridge is a continuation of Greenland and that its legal claim extends all the way to Russia's exclusive economic zone. That is a bid for nearly 900,000 square kilometers of Arctic space, or about 20 times the size of Denmark. The Danes submitted their legal claim in 2014, but it's still awaiting review. The problem with the Danish claim is that Greenland's internal politics have shifted further toward resource nationalism and distance from Copenhagen. And this is also where the United States comes in. The Lomonosov Ridge's geometry blocks America's shelf claims. Alaska alone cannot project claims toward the North Pole. Trump's bid to acquire Greenland is thus a workaround that places Washington within Arctic legal frameworks it otherwise cannot access. Even as Trump's idea is widely dismissed as reckless, his proposal does make strategic sense. Of course, there are economic, security, and trade-related interests in Greenland, and we covered these in a separate episode. But Greenland is not just a landmass, it is Denmark's gateway to the Arctic. Every Danish claim, including the bid to link the Lomonosov Ridge to Greenland, exists solely because Greenland is part of Denmark. Without it, Denmark simply disappears from the Arctic map. If America could acquire Greenland one way or another, it would immediately inherit the continental shelf claims, plus all its natural riches. What's more, unlike Denmark or Canada, America would have the naval and air power to enforce its claims. So, the rationale is that if the map cannot bend to Washington, then Washington must redraw the map. To understand what follows, it is essential to grasp what is at stake. Sovereignty over the seabed does not change a country's rights or ability to control shipping or carry out commercial fishing. So, while the Arctic Ocean is opening up and new shipping corridors are taking shape, an extended continental shelf will have no impact on such activities. Resources within the water and airspace beyond the exclusive economic zone belong to everyone and are regulated by international law. Ownership over an extended continental shelf is all about what's in, on, and under the seabed. Deposits of crude oil and natural gas are the primary commercial appeals. However, given the current oil price, extracting Arctic hydrocarbons is not economically feasible. It might eventually become more feasible in the future, but this is a long-term consideration. As far as we know, there is nothing in the Arctic seabed that is commercially worthwhile as of this report. But even without commercial incentives, there is something symbolic at play. The chance to claim ownership over the North Pole, long perceived as a source of myth and folklore. The North Pole holds tremendous cultural value. It is a place most people will never visit, and yet it holds a special place in the consciousness of many societies. Maps have long been tools of statecraft and national cohesion. They depict connections between communities and places. Maps assert sovereignty, portray progress, opportunity, and risk, and even though most flat maps are flawed, they remain influential. For example, in most American maps, Alaska is placed in a small inset box, relegating the state to a secondary geographic status. It is one of the reasons why Americans do not recognize their country as an Arctic nation. In China, meanwhile, the map is intentionally showcased vertically, so its territorial claims in the South China Sea become continuous with the mainland. Doing so reinforces the idea that China is both a continental and a maritime power. So, maps play an important role in shaping national policy and shaping public support. That's why Denmark, Canada, and Russia have included the North Pole in their legal submissions. All three petitioners see themselves as Arctic nations. America wants a seat at that table by edging Denmark out. The North Pole is the one place where all claims and would-be claims overlap. Denmark's interest comes from its autonomous territory, Greenland. Claiming the North Pole is a way of pacifying independence-seeking Greenland. Without Denmark, Greenland could never make a claim for the North Pole. It lacks the expertise and funding for scientific expeditions. So, Danish policymakers are ultimately trying to illustrate the benefits of Greenland's union with Denmark. For Canada, the Arctic has long been central to its national identity, with about 40% of its territory sitting in the Arctic Circle. However, Canadian scientists never intended to claim the North Pole. That was a political decision. When Canada filed its first claim in 2013, the borders stopped shy of the pole. The government withdrew the claim at the last minute and filed a new claim that actually covered the North Pole. So, claiming the pole is a matter of national prestige. It scores political points for the ruling government, and it plays into the narrative of Arctic sovereignty. The Russians have a like-minded outlook. Russia is seeking to develop the Northern Sea route along its Arctic coastline, which goes from Murmansk to Vladivostok. Doing so would not only boost trade, but also connect its Northern Fleet and Pacific Fleet in one uninterrupted arc. To support the logistics of such a corridor, Russia is revamping its Arctic defense infrastructure. It currently has more than 40 military installations along its Arctic coast, including bases, airfields, radar sites, and deep water ports. It also has 45 icebreakers, of which 37 are diesel-electric and 8 are nuclear-powered. Canada has little to compare, and Denmark has even less. Only the United States can counter Russia in the Arctic, and Greenland is central to that strategy. Trump's rhetoric is the result of that. That's how it goes sometimes. When interests overlap, alliances become negotiable. I've been your host Shervan from CaspianReport. If you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel on Patreon and click the bell icon so the next one doesn't slip past you. Thank you for your time and Saul.